The laser grid was going to kill her. Not because she'd miscalculated the angles, she never miscalculated angles, but because whoever had designed this particular configuration had a deeply personal vendetta against the human spine. Cleo Mercer hung suspended from a titanium anchor bolt she'd threaded through the ventilation shaft 40 seconds ago, her body inverted, her legs scissored around the cable with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this since before she was old enough to have a valid identification card. The infrared web below her, 43 beams, she'd counted twice, crisscrossed the vault floor in a pattern that was less security system and more abstract art installation dedicated to the theme of consequence. She breathed through her nose. Slow, controlled. The Sterling Atrium's penthouse vault sat 63 floors above the rest of the world, and from up here, inverted, the city's ambient glow bled through the reinforced skylight above her feet like a bruise spreading across dark fabric. She had 12 minutes before the guard rotation completed its loop. She had used 3 getting through the ventilation bypass. She was not going to waste another one admiring the architecture. "Archimedes!" she whispered into the comm bead tucked behind her left ear. "Perimeter status." Silence. She frowned. The clockwork owl's brass gears were calibrated to register sound at a frequency humans couldn't detect, and he should have been giving her a running commentary on every guard movement, every camera sweep, every atmospheric pressure shift in the corridor outside. His silence during active operations was categorically against his programming, which she had written herself, which meant either something had gone very wrong, or he had decided, again, that self-preservation outweighed professional obligation. "Archimedes!" Still nothing. Not even the small, anxious clicking of his beak that meant he was frightened, but functional. She filed this under problems she would solve after the primary objective and redirected her attention to the safe. The Kessler Vance 9 was a titanium biometric vault, the kind that security firms sold to clients who had run out of meaningful ways to spend money. It had a 17-point authentication sequence, electromagnetic shielding, and a secondary locking mechanism that triggered independently if the primary was bypassed incorrectly. It was, by any reasonable metric, impenetrable. Cleo pulled herself upright along the cable, a slow, controlled reversal that kept every limb inside the laser corridor's blind angles, and reached the vault's face. She pressed 2 fingers to the biometric panel and felt the faint warmth of the scanner activating. From inside the collar of her tactical suit, she withdrew a thin polymer sheet, nearly invisible, carrying a composite lift of the primary user's thumbprint. Acquiring that had taken 2 weeks, a catering uniform, and an extraordinary amount of patience at a charity gala. She laid it against the scanner with the care of someone handling very old paper. The panel blinked green. 1. She exhaled and moved to the secondary lock, an 8-digit rotary cipher, analog, which was somehow both more elegant and more irritating than the biometric. Analog locks didn't negotiate. They didn't have error tolerances. You were either right or you were wrong, and the only way to be right was to know exactly what you were doing. She knew exactly what she was doing. She pressed her ear to the titanium and began to turn. The Sterling Atrium had acquired the Mercer pocket watch 11 months ago through the Obsidian Auction House's private sale channel, an acquisition her family's legal representatives had contested on provenance grounds and lost because the documentation the Atrium submitted had been flawless, and the documentation her family held was older and therefore, by the auction house's preferred logic, less legitimate. The watch had belonged to her grandfather, his grandfather before that. It was a minor supernatural artifact by market standards, not powerful enough to attract serious collector interest, which made its presence in Elias Sterling's personal vault specifically baffling and specifically infuriating in equal measure. She'd planned this retrieval for 4 months. Click. The third tumbler seated. She kept turning, fingertip pressure feather light, listening for the sequential resistance that would tell her she was threading the right path through the cipher. 4. 5. The vault's interior climate control hummed faintly through the titanium under her palm. 6. 7. Archimedes! She tried one more time. Barely a breath. Nothing. 8. The lock disengaged with a sound like a held breath releasing, a soft, mechanical exhale, and the vault door swung inward on perfectly balanced hinges. Cleo reached inside. Her fingers closed around paper. She pulled it out. It was a card. Heavy stock, gold-embossed edges, matte black face. The kind of card that came with invitations to things that had no public record of occurring. On the front, in clean typeset that was almost aggressively tasteful, it read, "You are invited to tea." The reverse had a date, tomorrow, 11 in the morning, and the atrium's private residence address, which she already knew because she was standing inside it. There was no pocket watch. Cleo stared at the card for precisely 2 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed herself before the rest of her brain caught up to what this meant. The watch hadn't been here. The watch had never been here, or it had been moved. Or, and this was the thought that hit her like cold water, it had been removed specifically to make room for this card, which meant someone had known she was coming, which meant the last 4 months of meticulous planning had not been meticulous enough, which meant the vault lights came on, not gradually, not the slow bleed of emergency lighting finding its level, all of them at once, full spectrum, as if someone had simply decided that darkness was no longer a relevant option in this room. The laser grid dissolved, powered down from an external override, she registered distantly, because the beams simply ceased, rather than triggering any alarm she could detect. The vault was larger than she'd mapped it from the schematics. To her left, set back against the far wall between 2 glass artifact cases, was a leather armchair that had no business being this comfortable looking in a room that was technically a security installation. And in the leather armchair, long legs crossed at the ankle, one hand resting along the chair's arm with absolute ease, the other holding a wine glass containing something dark red that caught the new light beautifully, sat a man. He was enormous. Not in the way that registered as threatening at first glance, though it absolutely should have, she understood immediately, because the dark suit he wore was doing architectural work to contain a frame that had no reasonable explanation outside of something supernatural, but in the way that made the room's dimensions quietly rearrange themselves around him. 6'3", possibly more. Shoulders that belonged to a different category of person than the tailoring wanted to admit. A face that was, by any objective assessment, devastatingly constructed. Clean jaw, dark eyes that had too much intelligence in them, the kind of handsomeness that didn't announce itself but simply sat there and waited to be noticed. He noticed her noticing. The corners of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of someone watching a very elegant proof reach its conclusion. On his left shoulder, brass feathers gleaming under the vault lights, head swiveling with what could only be described as deep personal satisfaction, sat Archimedes. The mechanical owl clicked his beak once. Contentedly. Cleo looked at her owl. Her owl looked back at her with his amber glass eyes and had absolutely nothing to offer in his defense. "Traitor," she said. Archimedes ruffled his wings. The man in the armchair, and she knew who he was. She had studied his file until she could have reconstructed it from memory in a dark room, which made this moment considerably worse, took a slow sip of his wine, and regarded her with the unhurried attention of someone who had arranged this entire evening for his own entertainment and was finding the return on investment satisfactory. "Your landing form," Elias Sterling said, "was flawless." His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that filled a room without effort, that didn't need to climb to reach you. "The inverted approach through the laser grid, I've had that configuration assessed by 3 separate security consultants. They all concluded it was impassable without triggering at least 1 beam." A brief pause. They were embarrassed to be wrong. I found it refreshing. Cleo became aware, in the specific and unhelpful way one becomes aware of things at the worst possible moment, that she was still holding the invitation card. She lowered her hand. She did not put the card down, because putting it down would have required deciding where to put it, and she was not going to spend processing power on that right now. The lock-picking, he continued, tilting his head slightly, something moving in his dark eyes that she refused to classify as warmth because it was doing something alarming to her composure, was a little slow on the rotary phase. You favored your ring finger on the last 3 tumblers. Old habit? Rusty, she said, because it was the only response that preserved any dignity, and even that was marginal. His mouth curved. There it was, the full version of that almost smile, and it was worse than she'd anticipated, because it was not unkind. It was genuinely, specifically amused, and it was directed entirely at her, and Elias Sterling being amused by her was an outcome she had not modeled in any of her contingency planning. I've taken the liberty, he said, of having tea arranged for tomorrow. 11 o'clock. He gestured toward the card in her hand with a slight inclination of his wine glass. I'd like to discuss your appraisal skills. I have a collection that requires a very specific kind of expertise, and yours, Miss Mercer, he let the name land the way someone sets a card face up on a table, deliberate and final, is precisely specific enough. Cleo stood in the middle of his vault, in her tactical gear, holding his invitation, with her mechanical owl purring on his shoulder, under lights he had turned on at the moment of his choosing, and understood with cold and total clarity that she had not been executing a heist tonight. She had been attending an audition. The watch, she said, is safe. He said it simply, no flourish. As it has been for 11 months. It required a better security environment than your family's current holdings could provide. You can confirm its condition tomorrow, if you'd like. Another sip of wine. The dark eyes stayed on her face. Over tea. Archimedes clicked his beak again, apparently feeling that this conclusion was satisfying. Elias Sterling set his wine glass down on the armchair's side table, unhurried, and unfolded from the chair to his full height, and there it was, the full scope of what the tailored suit had been politely understating, the sheer contained mass of him, the way the room's proportions shifted again when he stood. He crossed toward her slowly, black leather gloves catching the light, and stopped at a distance that was technically courteous and practically devastating. You're about 4 feet off the ground, he observed, glancing at the cable still clipped to her harness, and then back to her face, and the dark amusement in his eyes had acquired something else, something quieter and more direct. Do you need me to catch you? Or will you manage the descent on your own? Cleo Mercer had broken into 47 secured locations across 11 years of work she would not describe to anyone under oath. She had never, not once, wanted the ground to open beneath her as badly as she wanted it right now. I'll manage, she said. His smile, unhurried and absolutely certain, said he already knew she would. The tea was excellent. Cleo would not have admitted this under interrogation, but the tea was genuinely, irritatingly excellent. Some single origin blend that tasted like it had been sourced from a mountainside that didn't appear on maps. And the pocket watch sat in a velvet-lined case at the center of the table between them, perfectly maintained, its brass casing polished to the same warm gleam she remembered from her grandfather's palm. And this made the entire situation considerably worse. The contract is standard, Elias said from across the table. He'd set his leather gloves beside his cup with the same care someone else might use to set down something fragile. His hands, bare, were large and deliberate in every movement. 3-month initial term, artifact appraisal, acquisition consultation, provenance verification for private sales through the Obsidian Channel. Your expertise, my collection, mutually beneficial arrangement. You had my owl surveilling me for how long? She asked instead of responding to any of that. Archimedes came to me, Elias said. On cue, the brass trader shifted on his dedicated perch in the corner of the room, a perch that had not existed last night, and had therefore been installed in the hours between her departure and this meeting, which said something specific about Elias Sterling's relationship with preparation. I simply provided a more interesting perch. He's clockwork. He doesn't have preferences. He has yours, Elias said, and picked up his tea, and looked at her over the rim with those dark, patient eyes, and did not elaborate. The watch sat between them. Cleo picked up the pen. The contract was, as advertised, standard, and she had read every line of it twice in the elevator on the way up, looking for the fine print that would constitute the trap, finding nothing more egregious than an exclusivity clause and a non-disclosure provision that applied equally to both parties. She signed it with the brisk efficiency of someone closing a door on a feeling they didn't intend to examine. Elias looked at her signature and then looked at her, and something in the line of his mouth suggested he found her briskness specifically transparent. "Welcome to the Sterling Atrium, Miss Mercer," he said. She reached for the watch on the table. Elias's hand moved not fast, but with the inevitable weight of gravity, and covered hers before she could touch the brass. The leather of his glove was warm. "Not yet," he said quietly. "The contract gives you access to my collection. It does not grant you the right to walk out with its most interesting piece on day one." He pulled the velvet case back across the table. That, more than anything, made her furious and fiercely determined. The collection occupied 3 floors of the atrium's private wing, climate-controlled and catalogued with a precision that would have been impressive if it hadn't also been slightly obsessive. Elias walked her through it on the first morning of her official employment, while Archimedes rode on his shoulder and offered brass commentary in the form of satisfied clicking, and Cleo trailed half a step behind and tried to assess the artifacts with professional detachment instead of the complicated awareness of his proximity that her nervous system kept filing urgent reports about. He was discussing a 16th-century cursed mirror's provenance when she interrupted him. "The binding inscription on the frame is a later addition," she said. 50 years post-origin. Minimum. Whoever sold this to you authenticated the mirror and ignored the frame entirely." Elias stopped walking. He turned to look at her, not the small, controlled pivot of someone politely redirecting their attention, but the full, unhurried rotation of someone recalibrating. His dark eyes moved to the mirror, then back to her. "The Kessler authentication certified the inscription as original," he said. The Kessler authentication was looking at the mirror. "The inscription is on the frame, which is oak, which is a different material with a different degradation pattern, and whoever added it used a binding dialect that wasn't standardized until the mid-1600s at the earliest." She crossed to the case and pointed, not touching the glass. "There, the 3rd glyph in the secondary binding row. That ligature didn't exist in the source dialect until it was borrowed from the northern tradition, and that borrowing is documented. You can date it." Silence. "You're telling me," Elias said, slowly, "that I paid a significant amount of money for a partially forged artifact. I'm telling you that the artifact itself is genuine, and the binding work is skilled, if later. Depending on what you paid for, you may have gotten exactly what you wanted." She met his eyes. "What did you pay for?" His mouth did the thing again. The almost smile, directed at her like a source of light aimed deliberately at a specific point. "The binding inscription," he said. "Then you overpaid." "I see," he said, and he was genuinely, quietly delighted, and this was categorically unfair, that I'm going to need to review the last 3 years of acquisitions. "Probably 4, she said. The Kessler firm had a staffing change in their Northern Authentication division in the spring of 2022 that I'd look at closely. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he moved to the next case, and the space he left when he stepped away felt specifically cooler than the room's climate control accounted for. And Cleo turned back to the mirror and told herself this was professional and temporary, and the watch was already in her pocket, and the situation was entirely under control. She went back for the safe that night. It was entirely about the watch. She had the contract. She acknowledged this. But the empty space against her sternum, where the brass casing belonged, felt like a challenge she was unwilling to lose. It was about the principle of the thing, The new security grid he'd installed over the vault was more sophisticated than the last one. A layered system that combined the infrared web with pressure-sensitive flooring and what she was fairly certain was a passive magical ward tied to the atrium's structural enchantments. She got through the infrared in under 6 minutes. The pressure-sensitive floor she bypassed by mapping the dead zones along the case supports, moving in a careful diagonal that the system's geometry couldn't cover without making the sensors impractically sensitive. The vault, when she reached it, had a new combination. She pressed her ear to the face, began to turn, and counted the tumblers until she had it. And then she stopped, because the number was not random. It was her birthday. Month, day, year, in the format of her own personal preference, which was a European convention she'd adopted in her early 20s, and which was not documented anywhere a security contractor would have access to. She opened the safe. Inside was a single handwritten note on heavy cream paper, in a clean, angular script that she did not need a handwriting sample to attribute. Faster than last night, but you favored the ring finger again on the rotary exit. E.S. Cleo stood in the dark vault and breathed through her nose and experienced a feeling for which she did not immediately have a word. Something between fury and the specific, complicated warmth of being known, which was its own kind of infuriating. She took the note. She did not know why she took it. She put it in her pocket next to the watch and climbed back out the way she'd come. The next night, the combination was her childhood address. Numerical, encoded, but she recognized it, the building number, the floor, the apartment, in sequence. Inside the safe was a second note. The approach through the east ventilation shaft is 11 seconds faster. You're welcome. E.S. She used the east shaft the following night and was furious to find he was right. The notes kept coming. He left them for her the way someone leaves a lamp on. Not a grand gesture, just a practical acknowledgement that she would be arriving and it would be useful to have the light. The safe combinations rotated through a private vocabulary of dates and numbers that could only have come from research, patient and thorough. And the notes ranged from tactical observations to dry commentary on her technique to, once, a brief and entirely earnest recommendation for a cable anchor system that he felt was superior to her current one, with a source. By day, they argued about provenance over artifacts that represented centuries of human ambition and supernatural accident. Their chairs pulled close enough to the examination table that she was consistently aware of the warmth radiating from him, the way his gloved hands moved over an object with the same careful attention he gave everything, the occasional moment when he would lean across her to point at something on a piece, and his shoulder would brush hers, and neither of them would move. Away. The displacement field on this binding box is running about 15 degrees off-center, she said one afternoon, not looking up from the lens. I know, he said, from approximately 4 inches to her left. You knew and you still acquired it? The displacement makes it more interesting, he said. Predictable artifacts are boring. She looked up. He was already looking at her. You're going to tell me something, she said, about how you feel about predictable things in general. I wasn't going to, he said. But now that you've raised it. She went back to the lens. He did not move away. The snare was in the east corridor of the subvault level, tucked into the shadow of a stone artifact pedestal that she'd mapped as inactive storage. It was old, genuinely, deeply old. The kind of magical construct that predated modern enchantment conventions by enough centuries that it operated on a logic that modern sensors didn't recognize as a threat signature. It looked, to every detection instrument she carried, like architectural residue, background noise. A dead enchantment long since burned out. It was not burned out. She felt it half a second before she would have triggered it. A shift in the air pressure directly below her leading foot, the specific cold electricity of an active working recognizing a target, and the part of her that had spent years reading the ambient language of enchanted spaces, threw every signal at once in a single, unified alarm. She pulled back. Not fast enough. Her foot came down on the outer boundary of the snare's activation radius. Not the center, but the edge. And the edge was enough. The construct snapped toward the contact point with the compressed speed of something that had been waiting a very long time. And there was a half-second of cold fire around her ankle and the genuine understanding that this was going to cause serious, lasting damage. The corridor lights did not come on. He came through the wall. Not metaphorically. Not through a door she hadn't catalogued. The far wall of the sub-vault corridor simply ceased to be a barrier, and Elias Sterling came through it the way a force of nature moves through the thing that was previously in its way, and the aura that preceded him was nothing like the contained, elegant presence she had catalogued during their working hours. This was older, larger. The specific, enormous pressure of something that had kept itself carefully leashed for a very long time, and had just, in this particular moment, stopped bothering. He crossed the corridor in 2 strides. His hand closed around her arm above the snare's contact point, and the other arm came around her back, and she was pulled flush against his chest with a controlled force that was somehow simultaneously the most careful and the most absolute physical experience of her life. She felt his heart, once, hard, fast, which was the only evidence that this had frightened him, that single beat, because everything else about him was locked and burning with a cold fury that had nowhere to go. He looked down at her. His face, in the dark, was not the face he wore during working hours. The mask was entirely absent. What was underneath it was something that looked at her the way a very old, very territorial creature looks at the single specific thing it has decided, without negotiation or apology, belongs to it. The snare is pre-consolidation, he said, and his voice was low and precise and absolutely level, in a way that was more frightening than shouting would have been. It wasn't indexed because my acquisitions team classified it as dormant. That was my error. A pause, measured and controlled. I will correct it. She was aware she should say something. She was aware she was not currently saying anything. Cleo. Her name in his mouth, without the miss, without the measured distance, without any of the elegant professional architecture he typically maintained between them, hit her in the sternum, like a physical thing. You can steal anything in this building you want. Every combination I set is yours. Every note I leave, take them, use them, burn them. I don't care. His grip didn't loosen. His eyes didn't move from her face. But you are forbidden, he said, very quietly, from bleeding on my territory. The old, enormous pressure of his aura settled back, slowly, like something large deciding to sit down. He was still holding her. She realized, in the particular clarity of a moment that cannot be taken back, that she had no intention of moving. Your east corridor, she said, because she had to say something and this was the truest thing she could reach, has a serious infrastructure problem. Something moved in his expression. Not the almost smile. Something underneath it. Something that had been waiting considerably longer than the snare had. I know, Elias Sterling said. I've been meaning to address it. The forgery took 9 days. Not because the relic was complicated. The Vanthorpe seal was, at its core, a relatively straightforward binding artifact. A disc of pressed obsidian, approximately the size of her palm, carved with a containment sequence that dated to the early medieval period and had been used, according to the 3 independent sources she'd cross-referenced, to imprison something that the sources described only as considerable. The original sat in Elias's sub-vault behind 3 layers of active warding that she had not attempted to breach, partly out of professional respect, and partly because the warding had a specific quality that made the back of her neck register opinions. The forgery took 9 days, because it had to be perfect. Not good enough to fool a casual observer. Not good enough to pass a surface-level scan. Perfect enough to survive 30 seconds of examination by a room full of European vampires who had collectively several thousand years of experience handling supernatural artifacts and no particular patience for being deceived. She worked at the examination table in the collection's main appraisal room, and Elias sat across from her on the second and third evenings, reading acquisition documentation while Archimedes dozed on his shoulder, and neither of them spoke for stretches of an hour or more. The silence had a texture to it now, comfortable and specific and warm in a way she had stopped pretending not to notice. "The carving pressure on the tertiary containment glyph is 0.5 millimeter too shallow," he said, at one point, without looking up from his documents. She looked at the forgery, then at him. "You're reading acquisition paperwork," she said. "I'm also watching you work," he said. "The tertiary glyph." She looked back at the forgery. He was correct. She deepened it without comment, and when she looked up again, his eyes were back on his documents, and the corner of his mouth was doing the thing she had given up trying to categorize. On the 9th day, she set the finished piece beside the original and took a photograph of both for reference, and the photographs, side by side, showed no meaningful difference. She found this professionally satisfying and personally unnerving in equal measure, because what it meant was that she was ready, which meant the auction was real, which meant she and Elias Sterling were about to walk into the Obsidian Auction House's sub-level black market floor as partners in front of the most dangerous concentration of supernatural predators that currently operated on this continent and perform a bait and switch that had exactly one attempt available to it. "You're certain about the intelligence?" she asked that evening. Elias set down his wine. "The Vanthorpe Syndicate has been acquiring leverage in the Obsidian Channel for 8 months. They want the seal because the entity it contains is one they believe they can negotiate with." A pause. "They cannot, but they will not know that until it's too late, and I have no interest in finding out what happens to the surrounding area when they learn. So we sell them a forgery. We sell them the satisfaction of believing they've outmaneuvered me," he said. "The forgery is the mechanism. The theater is the product." Archimedes, from his corner perch, produced a sound that might have been agreement or might have been a small mechanical nightmare. It was sometimes difficult to tell. The Obsidian Auction House's black market floor occupied a sub-level beneath the legitimate auction spaces, accessible through a secondary entrance that required a specific invitation and a willingness to conduct business in an environment where the ambient lighting was kept low enough to be a statement. The clientele for the evening's private session had been curated. 12 bidders, plus representatives, plus the house staff, plus what Cleo cataloged in her first 30 seconds inside as 8 security personnel distributed with the studied casualness of people who wanted to look decorative and actually functioned as a very serious threat response. She was wearing the vintage trench coat in deep charcoal, her hair up, the forgery in a velvet-lined case she carried with the precise confidence of someone who knows exactly what they're holding. Elias walked beside her in a dark suit and fresh leather gloves, and the room's attention moved toward him the way iron filings orient toward a magnet, not because he demanded it, but because whatever he was underneath the tailoring had the quality of a low-frequency sound that the body registers before the ears do. Several of the assembled bidders were vampires. She knew the taxonomy, the specific stillness, the way they occupied space without quite displacing air the way living bodies did, the eyes that had too much depth in them. The Vanthorpe representatives were easy to identify, 3 of them, stationed at the far end of the room with the relaxed confidence of people who had already decided how the evening would proceed. The one in the center was old. She couldn't have said precisely how she knew this. His face read early 40s. His suit was contemporary. His posture was unremarkably elegant. But there was a weight to him that age accumulates, and he had a great deal of it. He looked at the case in her hand and smiled, and the smile did not reach the depth of his eyes. "Archimedes," she murmured, the calm bead live. A burst of soft clicking from the earpiece. He was somewhere in the upper ventilation structure, which she had identified as his most likely insertion point when they'd walked the building's exterior. The clicking resolved into a pattern she'd trained him to use for head counts and position mapping. 3 distinct groups, 2 on the east side, 1 consolidating near the exit. They were already moving to cover the doors. She didn't look at Elias. She adjusted her grip on the velvet case by 3 millimeters, which was the signal they'd agreed on. His hand, gloved, came to the small of her back for exactly 1 second. Light, specific, acknowledged. And then they walked to the presentation podium. The house auctioneer handled the preamble with practiced neutrality, the kind of professional effect that came from years of not asking questions about provenance. Elias stood beside her at the podium, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression conveying the precise calibration of a collector who was willing to part with a significant piece, but had not yet decided the room deserved it. Lot 7, the auctioneer said. The Vanthorpe seal. Provenance documentation available for review. Bidding opens at... There's no need for bidding, said the old vampire from across the room. He hadn't moved, precisely, but he had consolidated his presence in a way that the room registered. We discussed terms with your representative last week, Mr. Sterling. I believe we had an agreement. You had a figure, Elias said. I had other offers. A pause that functioned as a threat. I'd like to examine the piece, the vampire said. Cleo set the velvet case on the podium and opened it. She watched his eyes. This was the critical window. 30 seconds, maybe 40, while his attention was on the forgery and not on her face, and the forgery needed to hold under the scrutiny of centuries of artifact handling experience. She had given it 9 days. She had deepened the tertiary glyph to Elias's specification. She had matched the obsidian's surface microtexture using a technique she'd developed for an entirely different job and never expected to use at this scale. The old vampire crossed to the podium. He looked at the seal for a long moment. He reached into his jacket and produced a small scanner, modern, calibrated for magical resonance signatures, and passed it over the surface. The scanner registered positive. Of course it did. She had spent day 6 alone encoding a resonance bleed into the forgery's surface using a sympathetic transfer technique that she had, technically, invented during the process of this particular job, and which she was privately quite proud of. He looked up at her. Acceptable, he said. The exchange took 4 minutes. Documentation, transfer of consideration, the velvet case changing hands. Cleo kept her breathing even and her expression at the specific neutral register of someone completing a professional transaction, and beside her Elias was a study in composed indifference, and neither of them moved toward the exit. They should have moved toward the exit. She knew this in the same half-second that the room's energy shifted. The consolidation she'd read from Archimedes' positioning report, snapping from preparatory to active. The security personnel at the doors no longer performing decorative and now simply blocking. And the old vampire turning back from his representative with the forgery in hand and looking at them both with an expression that had shed its social function entirely. The resonance signature is correct, he said. The containment sequence has a manufacturing error in the 4th binding ring that the original does not. A pause, thin as a blade. We had the original examined 6 weeks ago, photographically. We know what it looks like. Cleo said nothing. Take the woman, he said. 3 of them moved toward her, fast in the way vampires are fast, which is less like speed and more like the space between positions simply ceasing to exist. And she had her back to the podium and her exits covered, and the case was already gone, and the situation had, with remarkable efficiency, become genuinely dangerous. A hand closed on her arm. Then, Elias removed his gloves. He did it the way he did everything, without urgency, without performance, each glove drawn off with a single smooth pull and folded with precise, unhurried care. He set them on the podium beside him. The gesture was so controlled, so completely unrelated to the physical reality of 3 vampires currently reaching for his partner, that it functioned as its own species of threat. The old vampire went still. What came next was not visible. It was not a light, or a sound, or a movement. It was a pressure, an atmospheric shift, as if the room's dimensions had quietly recalibrated around a new gravitational center, as if the air itself had received information about what was standing in it, and decided to behave accordingly. The sensation started at the base of the spine and moved upward, and it carried with it the specific, ancient, entirely non-negotiable communication of something that had been the apex of its order for longer than most of the things in this room had existed. The three vampires stopped moving. They did not choose to stop. They stopped the way a body stops at the edge of a very deep drop, involuntarily, completely, the decision made somewhere below the level of volition. The one holding Cleo's arm released her. Then, slowly, they went to their knees. One by one, around the room. The security personnel, the bidders, the house staff, the old vampire last, with the specific resistance of something very old meeting something older, the resistance lasting exactly as long as it took him to understand that he was not going to win this, and then ceasing entirely. He knelt. His face was entirely blank, which was the face of someone who has just had their entire model of the relevant hierarchy revised without their consent. Elias walked through the room. Not quickly, not with any of the urgency the situation might technically have called for. He walked the way he always walked, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone for whom arrival is a formality because the destination was never in question. And the kneeling figures on either side of his path did not look up. And Cleo understood, watching him come toward her, that they were physically incapable of doing so. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, the full, direct attention that he deployed in the vault and at the examination table and in the silence of working evenings, the attention that had no professional architecture around it, that was simply his actual regard, unmediated. He took her hand. She let him. She would examine this decision later, at length, and reach no conclusion that simplified it. Then he turned to face the room. "The Vanthorpe seal," he said, to the assembled kneeling occupants of the Obsidian Auction House's black market floor, in the same conversational register he used to discuss provenance documentation, "is not for sale. It has not been for sale. This evening was a demonstration of what happens when syndicate representatives conduct surveillance on my collection without my invitation." A pause, brief and complete. "The demonstration is now concluded." His hand was warm around hers, even through the absence of the gloves. "One additional point of clarification," Elias said, and his voice carried the easy, absolute authority of someone making a notation that he considers obvious but has decided to formalize for the record. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, deliberate, specific. "Miss Mercer is not a negotiable asset. She is not leverage. She is not a target." A brief silence, in which the room's kneeling occupants had nothing to contribute. "She is my private and non-negotiable masterpiece, and I will treat any future confusion on this point as the most significant error of your very long lives." Archimedes, from somewhere in the ventilation above them, produced a sound of extreme brass satisfaction. Cleo looked at the side of Elias's face. The posture was composed. The expression was calm. The hand holding hers had not loosened by a single degree. She thought about 9 days of silence at an examination table. She thought about combinations set to her birthday, notes left in empty safes, a recommended cable anchor system with a source. She thought about a corridor wall that had ceased to matter, and a voice saying her name without the professional distance, and the specific, enormous warmth of being held by something that had decided, without negotiation or qualification, that she was not permitted to be harmed. She tightened her fingers around his. "Masterpiece," she said under her breath. The corner of his mouth moved. "It's an accurate classification," Elias Sterling said. "I am, above all else, a collector with excellent taste." The car ride back from the Obsidian auction house was quiet, in a way that had weight to it. Archimedes had descended from the ventilation system via a route that Cleo declined to examine too closely, and was now settled on the back seat between them, radiating the self-satisfied energy of someone who had participated in a successful operation and intended to be acknowledged for it. Elias had retrieved his gloves from the podium before they left. He wore them again now, hands resting on his knee, watching the dark city move past the window with the same expression he wore when he was deciding something he had already decided. "You knew they'd photographed the original," she said. "6 weeks ago, yes. And you let me spend 9 days on a forgery." A pause. "Your forgery was exceptional. The resonance encoding in particular was technique I hadn't seen before." He turned from the window. "I would have told you about the photographs if I'd thought it would change the outcome. It wouldn't have. The forgery was never the point. The demonstration was the point." "They needed to understand the terms clearly," he said. "They do now." She looked at him in the dark of the car, at the composed, illuminated line of his profile, and thought about a room full of ancient predators on their knees, and a voice saying her name, like it was a boundary he was drawing around something he had no intention of permitting to be damaged. "The vault," she said. "Your actual vault, not the one I've been breaking into." He looked at her. "You've been generous with the combinations," she said. "You've left notes. You powered down the laser grid, but there's a sub-level below the one I've been working, and the warding on it is old enough that my instruments don't classify it as a security system. They classify it as geology." She watched his face. "That's the one." A long moment. "Yes," Elias said. "I want to see it." He looked at her for another moment, and whatever the consideration was, it resolved quietly and completely, the way his considerations always did. "All right," he said, and turned back to the window, and the car moved through the dark. The entrance to the deep vault was not in the building's security infrastructure. It was in the sub-level corridor, behind the stone pedestal where the ancient snare had been, now disarmed, the space around it carrying the specific clean quality of a working that had been carefully, thoroughly dismantled. There was a door in the wall that she had cataloged as a maintenance panel, and was not a maintenance panel. It was 3 inches of solid stone faced with plaster, and it opened to Elias's bare hand, right glove removed, pressed flat to the surface, with a sound like a long exhale. Beyond it, stairs. Old stone, worn smooth in the center from use, descending at a shallow angle for longer than the building's sub-level should have accommodated, which meant the vault occupied space that did not technically correspond to the building's footprint, which meant the architecture had opinions she hadn't mapped. She followed him down. The room at the bottom was vast. Her eyes adjusted slowly, the ambient light coming from somewhere she couldn't source, a warm, low illumination that seemed to rise from the stone itself. She had expected, she had prepared herself for, the visual grammar of a serious collector's private hoard. Display cases, artifact mounts. The dense, pressurized atmosphere of a room containing too much value in too small a space. The room was nearly empty. At the center, a long stone table. On it, 3 items. To the left, a letter, a single folded page. The paper so old it had acquired the color of weak tea, the ink faded to near illegibility. Beside it, a painting, small, the canvas torn at the upper right corner and repaired with such care that you had to look closely to find the seam. The paint was old enough that the surface had cracked along its age lines into a fine web that caught the light like a glaze. And at the far end of the table, on a velvet pedestal, dark navy, the exact shade of blue she associated with formal preservation practice, her family's pocket watch. She stood in the entrance of the room and looked at these 3 things for a long moment. A letter, she said, a torn painting, and the watch. There are others, Elias said from beside her, distributed through the room. A child's hair ribbon, a set of mathematical workings on paper, 3 pages, unsigned, a pressed flower in a small glass frame, the species of which no longer exists. He paused. 41 items, in total. She moved into the room slowly, looking. Along the walls she found them, set into recessed shelves at intervals, each individually lit, each presented with the same careful attention she'd seen him give the collection upstairs. Not displayed. Preserved. There was a difference, and the difference was evident in the quality of his attention to each mounting, the specific gentleness of the environmental controls, the absence of any acquisition documentation or market notation. These items had no price histories. They had not been catalogued for sale. "The letter," she said. "A 17-year-old girl wrote it to her brother during a border conflict," he said. He was 14. She was trying to explain to him why she wasn't afraid, so that he wouldn't be afraid either. The letter took her 3 days to write. He never received it. A pause. "I found it in the rubble of the building where he'd been sheltering. I don't know what happened to either of them." Cleo stood very still. "The painting," she said. "A man painted his wife on the occasion of their 40th anniversary. He had no formal training. The torn corner happened during a flood that destroyed most of their household. He repaired it himself, the same night, sitting in the street outside what had been their home." Elias's voice was even, unhurried. "He carried it with him for the rest of his life. When he died, he had almost nothing. He had the painting!" She turned to look at him. He was standing a few feet from her, hands at his sides, the left glove still on, the right bare from when he'd opened the door. He was looking at the table with an expression she had not seen before, or rather, she had seen the components of it, separately, in the vault and at the examination table and in the corridor when he'd pulled her against him and told her she was forbidden from bleeding. This was all of them at once, and without the elegant containment he wore like a second suit. He looked very old. Not in his face, which had not changed from the composed, specific handsomeness she had catalogued since the first evening in the vault, but in the eyes, in the depth of them, the accumulated weight of 41 items on stone shelves and a building's worth of years spent keeping faith with things that no one else was keeping. "The watch," she said. Her voice had come out softer than she'd intended. "Your ancestor's name was Thomas Mercer," Elias said. "He was 26 years old. The winter of that year was the 3rd consecutive season of failed harvests, and he had 4 children, the youngest of which had been ill since October. He brought the watch to a pawnbroker in the market town nearest to his farm in early January. He told the broker it had been in his family for 60 years. He accepted a price that was well below its value because he needed the full amount by the end of the week, and the broker knew it." A pause. "The broker sold it at auction 3 months later. I acquired it there." Cleo looked at the watch on its velvet pedestal. "You've had it for 200 years, she said. "I was waiting," he said, "for someone clever enough to find it and brave enough to take it back. You could have simply—" "No," he said, quietly, but with absolute certainty. "It was not mine to give. The claiming had to be earned. That is the condition of everything in this room." He looked at her directly. The full, unmediated regard she had grown to understand was the rarest thing he offered anyone. Thomas Mercer pawned the watch to feed his family. He did what the moment required of him. The watch survived because he was practical and loved his children more than he loved the object. That decision deserves to be honored, not corrected by someone with more resources and no skin in the outcome. The room was very quiet. She thought about 4 months of planning, 9 days at a forgery table, a succession of vault combinations set to the private vocabulary of her life. She thought about notes in empty safes, and a cable anchor recommendation, and a corridor wall that had ceased to be a wall. She thought about 41 items on stone shelves, a letter that never arrived, a painting repaired in a flood-ruined street, 2 centuries of a single immortal creature keeping faith with the accumulated evidence that humans loved things fiercely and briefly and with their whole capacity. She picked up the watch. It was warm in her palm, warmer than the ambient temperature of the room accounted for. The specific warmth of an object that had been carefully maintained, kept at a consistent temperature, handled with consistent attention. She closed her fingers around it and felt its weight, and thought about Thomas Mercer in an early January market town, making the only choice available to him. Then she turned and held it out to Elias. He looked at her hand. "Take it," she said. "Cleo, you've been guarding it for 200 years, she said. "You've been guarding all of them, 41 things that someone loved and lost, and that you picked up off the ground and kept because nobody else was going to." She took one step toward him. "You're the loneliest person I have ever met, and you have an excellent poker face, and I am not leaving this watch in a room where the only company it has is a torn painting and a letter that never arrived." He was very still. "I can't steal the watch," she said. "I've established that. You've outmaneuvered me at every available opportunity, and I'm choosing to find that attractive rather than professionally humiliating, which is a significant concession." She took the final step. "So I'm going to have to steal the vault's owner instead." She took his lapels in both hands. Good fabric, exceptional tailoring, the specific quality of something that had been made to last, and pulled him down and kissed him. He kissed her back with the same quality he brought to everything, complete, unhurried, specific. The absolute attention of something that did not do things by half measures, and had been waiting considerably longer than he'd allowed himself to acknowledge. His bare hand came up to her face, careful and warm, and the other, still gloved, because he was still himself, still the composed, elegant architect of his own containment, settled at her waist with a gentleness that was somehow more overwhelming than the alpha aura in the obsidian auction house had been. Because that had been power directed outward, and this was something else entirely. From somewhere near the entrance to the vault, Archimedes clicked. Then he spun, the full rotation gear-driven spin he reserved for occasions he classified as significant, his brass wings catching the ambient light in a warm sweep, and clicked again, with the deep mechanical satisfaction of someone who had been managing this situation from a ventilation system for several weeks, and felt that the conclusion was both overdue and correct. Cleo broke the kiss long enough to look at her owl. "Don't," she said. Archimedes clicked one more time, unrepentant, and settled his wings. She looked back at Elias, up close, with the professional distance entirely absent. His face had a quality she hadn't had the standing to examine before. The specific, unguarded openness of something very old being genuinely, unexpectedly surprised. She had the understanding that Elias Sterling had anticipated a great many things in a very long life, and that she had just done something he had not predicted, and that this pleased her in a way she intended to revisit at length. She pressed the watch into his bare hand and closed his fingers around it. "Keep it," she said. "You've earned the custody. But I want visiting rights." His hand tightened around the watch. Around her. "Negotiable," he said, and the word had no negotiation in it whatsoever. The deep vault was quiet and warm, and full of 41 small, fierce human things that had survived against the odds because something vast and patient and essentially lonely had decided they were worth the trouble of keeping. Above them, the Sterling Atrium rose 63 floors into the sky, and somewhere in its collection a binding box ran 15 degrees off-center because its owner found predictable things boring, and the most elegant security system in the known supernatural world had combinations set to a birthday that belonged to a thief who had broken in 17 times and been expected every single one. The greatest treasures, it turned out, were never the ones that could be catalogued. They were the ones that stayed. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Drop a comment below and tell us which moment was your favorite. We read every single one. Your support is what makes these stories possible. And there's so much more coming. See you in the next one.